It's August 26th, 1988, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Arion, Rebecca, and Olly, the Retrospectors.
What's the longest time you've ever spent in an airport? Probably a few hours, perhaps a day or a night if you've been caught in delays. But Mehran Karimi Nasseri, an Iranian who went by the name Sir Alfred, certainly has you beat, because today in history, in 1988, he set up camp in Paris's Charles de Gaulle airport, where he would remain for the next 18 years.
Yeah, and if you're thinking, that sounds like a familiar story, but wasn't he American and didn't he shag Catherine Zeta-Jones? You're thinking of the Steven Spielberg film The Terminal, which was inspired by this story, but in the loosest possible way when you look at the details. Hollywood basically said, yeah, let's do that, but make him not Iranian and have no mental health issues. But the truth was, on this day, Nasseri, then 43 years old, had already spent years wandering around Europe as a kind of Iranian refugee, looking for somewhere to settle, trying to find his way to Britain. And that morning had arrived at Charles de Gaulle Airport with a one-way ticket to London, which you could do then without a passport. You could get through into the airport and wait for your flight pre-9/11 without a passport. It was only when you then arrived at London Heathrow, as he did, that they were like, mate, you don't have any papers, you're going back to Charles de Gaulle. And suddenly he found himself in this limbo. If he left the airport, he knew he'd be imprisoned for not having papers, because that had happened to him twice before in France, so he didn't want to risk that. But he knew he no longer could get to Britain, so he just decided to camp out in the terminal.
I mean, and quite a lot of the story of how and why he got here and why he was camping out is a bit mysterious, not least because Nasseri himself was very unclear on his own personal story. So at least what we think we know about him is that he was born in a small oil-producing town in southwestern Iran. His father was an Iranian physician working for the Anglo-Iranian oil company, but according to Nasseri, his mother was a Scottish nurse. He sometimes said she was of Swedish descent, but these claims have never really been substantiated, and it's quite a lot more likely that his mother was Iranian. Anyway, Nasseri travelled to England to study Yugoslav studies at the University of Bradford in 1973. And again, according to his account, while in the UK, he participated in these student protests against the Shah of Iran. And when he returned home in 1977, he was then arrested, so he said, by the Shah's secret police, and tortured and stripped of his citizenship and expelled from the country. All of this is very disputed, but at least that serves to explain why he said he was a victim of injustice and a refugee who wasn't able to go back to his home country anymore.
Yeah, the UN High Commission for Refugees were never able to find any evidence that Nasseri had been expelled from Iran. It was later hypothesized that maybe he fled to avoid being conscripted in the Iran-Iraq War in 1980. But he made asylum claims in several European countries, and he was actually accepted in at least two, East Germany and the Netherlands, but it seemed like his sights were set very firmly on the UK. He had it in his head that he was going to go and find his mother, the Scottish nurse, but he got turned down for asylum in the UK. He was granted asylum by Belgium in 1980 after being stopped at the border trying to get into West Germany. He lived there for 6 years. And because of his residence in Belgium, he was able to travel elsewhere within Europe relatively easily. And so he took a ferry trip to Britain, again, hoping to search for his probably non-existent Scottish mother. When he arrived at Folkestone, his documentation had gone missing. He claimed it had been stolen, but it's thought he actually posted it back to Brussels when he arrived in the UK, hoping it would stop him being sent back to Belgium. But he was then returned, but he obviously couldn't enter Belgium now because he didn't have a passport. He ended up in France. He was briefly imprisoned for entering illegally. This is where the story is quite confusing and incomplete, but he seems to have just been bouncing around, being turned away from various borders until this incident in 1988, where he turned up at Charles de Gaulle. He was taken to a designated area for passengers who didn't have appropriate documentation. And from there, he just sort of drifted into Terminal 1 and then just stayed there.
For 18 years, becoming perhaps the world's most famous homeless person. He was so well known as a kind of installation next to the Bye Bye Bar that letters would arrive to him that would simply be addressed the man on the bench, Charles de Gaulle, including money. A traveller once gave him a sleeping bag and a camping mattress. The doctor in the airport itself was looking after his health as best he could and gave him paper. And that paper then formed part of his daily routine, which is kind of fascinating. There's been well documented in a book about this called The Terminal Man. He would get up at 5 a.m. and go and wash himself in the gents' restroom. Then he would go to McDonald's for breakfast every day for 18 years. Just think of that. And that actually was paid for by vouchers that had been given to him by passing aircrew, because they'd get food vouchers for the airport. Then he'd spend all day writing his account of the day's news on this paper that was given to him by the airport doctors. There's this fascinating document which exists, which is, his life's work of 18 years of writing about what's happening in the headlines from his perspective in sort of no man's land airport limbo.
Yeah, and he wore M&S clothing that had been donated, I think, by M&S themselves. They had, and I think still have, a branch in Charles de Gaulle, and cleaned for him, presumably, again, as a favour, by the airport's dry cleaners. And his overall demeanour was very dry and debonair and kind of old-worldy, not quite enough to mask the fact that there was clearly paranoia and delusion lurking just beneath the surface. But he was very charming. He loved to talk to people, and he spent most of his days just chatting to passers-by. He insisted on being called Sir Alfred. He denied that he was Iranian at this point. He even pretended not to speak Farsi, because you can imagine what it would be like to be a lawyer representing his lawyers had to say, no, he does understand. He does speak Farsi. He's just pretending not to, because he had really adopted this persona that was completely... It's funny because he was in the airport, nothing was changing. He was living this repetitive existence, but he had completely changed himself. You just had this character living in the airport who now didn't even acknowledge that he was Mehran Nasseri, an Iranian refugee who was trying to seek asylum in the UK. He was just the airport man.
The lawyer who eventually took up his case, who was this prominent French human rights lawyer called Christian Bourget, who took his case up pro bono and for the next decade waged this relentless campaign against French and Belgian and international bureaucracies trying to secure his client's freedom. And in 1992, a French court ruled that Nasseri had been living inside the transit terminal zone legally, and so he couldn't be forcibly removed by police. But the court also ruled that it couldn't compel the French government to grant him an entry visa. And so it took another 7 years of legal manoeuvring until 1999, when Belgium finally agreed to mail his refugee documents to Paris, basically allowing France to issue him with an official residency permit and an international passport. But the weird thing is that when Bourget finally presented Nasseri with his official papers in 1999, he was expecting there to be a big celebration. But Nasseri refused to sign them because, I guess, more than a decade of living inside this fluorescent lit transit lounge had inflicted yet more psychological damage on him. What he said was that he wasn't going to sign the papers because they were obviously fake, and they had his nationality listed as Iranian rather than British, and they identified him as Mehran Karimi Nasseri instead of Sir Alfred. And so the airport basically had stopped being his prison and had become a kind of sanctuary or something. This was a place that now he wasn't stuck anymore. It was the place that he wanted to live.
Yeah, and it was actually 2006 in the end that he left the airport. So 7 years after he technically was told by the French authorities, you can have citizenship and we will not arrest you, and it is fine for you to leave the airport. So he clearly had mental health issues, but also physical health issues, which ultimately is why he left in 2006. He had a physical illness and went to hospital. He'd spent 18 years living in a place surrounded by polluting planes and cars, obviously, but also very cold on a winter's night. With sleep deprivation, there were announcements that were only paused between 1 and 4 a.m., lights that almost never went off, cleaners in the terminal when the passengers weren't. And over time, I think, he ended up in hospital. But then, of course, he could walk out the hospital. So at that point, really fascinatingly, he ends up in a homeless shelter. But the homeless shelter moves him on because he has money. He had $250,000 in the bank from Steven Spielberg for his life rights. Yeah. So they were like, you can't live here because you're not poor. And he sort of eked out this existence over the next few years, ultimately trying to recreate the sense of home and belonging that he weirdly had felt inside Charles de Gaulle.
Yeah, he had also, a year after the Terminal movie came out, he'd released an autobiography that was written with the help of the British writer Andrew Donkin. So he had, as you said, he had the proceeds of that as well. But he drifted between various Paris homeless shelters, not really belonging to one world or the other. You know, he at this point, he just couldn't reintegrate into wider society. But as you said, his finances really meant that he couldn't access the services that were intended for true down and outs either. So at the time of his death in 2022, it was reported that he had recently set up camp in the airport again, and he died there of a heart attack in November 2022. He was 76. But looking into this, I found that his record of 18 years is not the longest that anyone has ever lived in an airport. You know, it feels hard to beat. Yes, Bayram Topali was a Turkish cleaner at Ataturk Airport in Istanbul in 1991, age 26. He got the job, but then he had ill health and he was let go. But what had happened was that he had left his small town because there were family problems, poverty. He didn't want to go home, so he simply decided to stay at the airport. And he ended up living there for 27 years, more than half of his life, and he only left because the airport closed to passenger services in 2019. Yes. And at this point, he relocated to another Istanbul International Airport, where, as far as I can tell, he still lives.
Wow, I can only assume that we don't know this story so well because he never had sex with Catherine Zeta-Jones.
Yeah. Didn't have a Marks and Spencer suit.
Yeah.
Tomorrow.
Basically, they just put Dad in a Tom Good-style jumper and gave Mummy a Delia Smith haircut.
Ditch the ads and get a Sunday episode when you join Club Retrospectors. Patreon.com/Retrospectors.